But tonight it is my honor to present the first annual Alumnus of the Year Award to an amazing individual and personal role model of mine. Now, he is no stranger to being awarded for his outstanding accomplishments. In 2006, he received the Herman Lay Award for Entrepreneurship. Later, he was honored by the World Economic Forum for being a distinguished leader under the age of 40. And while he's an alumnus today, when he was an undergrad at Stanford University, he founded the Stanford Review, which is the main libertarian newspaper on campus today. He was representing SFL ideals a decade before there was an SFL. He's also an amazing chess player, considered one of the best under the age of 21 when he was under 21. One of his strategies was to predict what his opponent would do and use it to his advantage. He took that mindset to the business world when he co-founded and led PayPal until 2002, when he sold it to eBay for $1.5 billion. He was also known for warning the world of the dot-com bubble and the real estate bubble, which I guess eventually burst. But even despite his success with PayPal, his momentum didn't slow. He successfully launched several venture capital and hedge funds that helped develop and accelerate innovation. It is his goal to help prevent a technological deficit that he foresees having a severe economic impact on society. Through his funds and private investment, he has contributed to the next generation of tech companies. Tech companies that have revolutionized the way we live and use the internet. Companies like SpaceX, LinkedIn, Causes, Spotify, and a little thing called Facebook. His accomplishments are not limited to the private sector. He has contributed a lot to society through his charitable givings. In 2010, he created the 20 Under 20 Thiel Fellowship, which mentored 20 tech visionaries under the age of 20, one of which came from my alma mater at Arizona State. His philanthropy also includes supporting organizations that promote equality and innovative projects like anti-aging research and the Seasteading Institute. He has also contributed to the Wall Street Journal, First Things, and Forbes magazine. His hard work as an innovative entrepreneur and philanthropist has undoubtedly changed our world, impacted our generation, and shaped our future for the better. It is no surprise then that he has earned this award. Please welcome me in joining Peter Thiel, the 2012 Alumnus of the Year, on stage.
It's an incredibly exciting time to be a libertarian. You know, one is always somewhat pessimistic. There's so many things about libertarianism that make one pessimistic about the future. We have all these theories about why the government inexorably is going to grow and take away more freedom over time. And I think just being here and seeing all of you in the audience is something that suggests, reminds us that there is something about this particular moment in the U.S. that is an unusually libertarian moment. And I want to reflect a little bit on why I think this is such a great moment for libertarianism, and why we, for the first time in perhaps 80 or 90 years, actually have a chance to move the country back into the direction of classical liberalism, of libertarian ideas, and having a less intrusive government in both economic and social areas. A great number of political debates get framed as debates about the future, but they often are also important debates about the past. And we're in this country at this time. We have a very important debate about the Great Recession that started in 2008 that really has no end in sight, and it's a debate about what caused it. And then, you know, as you analyze that, you can sort of have debates about what might cure it. And I think it is, in some interesting ways, a counterpoint to the debate in the 30s, which I think the libertarian side, the laissez-faire capitalist side, lost very badly, where you had a debate about what caused the Depression, and fairly, unfairly, the blame sort of fell on the side that had been questioning government against government, and somehow the New Deal won, and it sort of kept building on its victories in the decades ahead. And I think there is a sort of very interesting way in which this current crisis gives us a chance to reevaluate not just the history of recent years, but also the history of the last century or two. I come at the question of what's been going on in the US and the world from a perspective that's heavily driven by technology. I'm interested in a lot of other areas, but I think the question of technology is one that I've been very interested in. I've been involved in the computer internet revolution of the last decade and a half, and then more broadly have been looking for what are some other opportunities to invest in technology, and how much of it has been happening, how well has it been going on. And one of the questions I've started to ask myself in recent years is this question about how much technological progress is actually happening, and are we still living in a technologically accelerating civilization? Is it getting faster and faster? Is it getting faster, or is it actually decelerating and in some ways slowing down a great deal? And the basic conclusion that I've reached in looking at this is that outside of computers and the internet and maybe finance, we've had basically extremely little innovation for the last 40 years. And I want to sort of share a few of those conclusions and some thoughts on why, and then some thoughts on what can be done about it and how we can move forward. If you look at almost everything impacting the real world, it's remarkable how little things have changed. If you looked at the fashions people wear, they're not that different from what they would have been in 1990. If you look at the cars people drive, to first approximation, they look pretty similar. The planes people fly are similar. Ask the question, the most literal version of the question, are we moving faster? The answer was, we moved faster every decade from 1500 onwards until about 1980. It was faster sailing ships, faster railroads in the 19th century, faster cars, faster planes, culminating with the Concorde in '76, which was decommissioned in 2003. And today, air travel speeds are basically back to where they were in 1960, if you add in the very low-tech airport security measures that have been added. And then if you ask, why has there been this failure of innovation in transportation? One of the big reasons for it has been a failure of innovation in energy, where basically prices of oil are way above. We've never quite recovered from the oil shocks of the '70s. The prices today, in inflation-adjusted terms, are probably higher than they were at the worst point in the '70s. You have seen sort of a recurrent failure of alternatives to energy. Clean tech is an increasingly toxic word in Silicon Valley for companies that don't work. You have, nuclear power, of course. It has been dead for many decades. You didn't need the recent disaster in Japan last year to remind it. It would be sort of committing malpractice to encourage any undergraduate to study nuclear engineering at this point. And of course, and if you look at someone like Warren Buffett, who's often respected as one of the sort of great investors of our time, his single biggest investment is in railroads in the U.S., which is sort of a massive bet that we will go, the 21st century will look more like the 19th than like the 20th. And basically, 40% of what gets transported in railroads is coal. So you're basically betting that we're going to go back to coal and back to rail as the way the future is going to work, and that all these sorts of areas of technological innovation around transport and energy are not quite working out. When you look at food, agriculture, we had a great green revolution in the 50s and 60s, increasing worldwide food production by about 125% between 1950 and 1980. In the decades since then, food production has gone up by maybe 40–45%, barely keeping pace with global population growth. And so when you look at events in the Middle East, there sort of is a very optimistic technological story where it's around the internet and communication and people tweeting, and I think there's definitely some truth to that. But there's also sort of a technologically pessimistic story of what's going on in the Middle East, and the immediate trigger over the last year was that food prices had gone up by 30–50%, and that in some ways you had sort of these desperate people who become more hungry than scared. When one looks at biotechnology, which I think by all rights is an area where we should be seeing revolutionary progress today, given how much our understanding of biology has advanced in recent decades. There may be a third as many drugs in the pipeline as there were 15 years ago, and you have again the story of still some momentum, but many worrisome signs of deceleration ahead. Now, I would submit this question of why has there been this technological deceleration, and why has it happened, is one of the most important political public policy questions we should be trying to tackle as a country. And I think the sort of the libertarian answer I would suggest is that basically we've had incredible progress in areas where there was no regulation, and we've had extremely limited progress in areas where there was regulation. I think it's really as simple as that. It's not that we've run out of ideas. It's not that somehow we're at the end of history and incremental progress is hard, but it is sort of really a story of two different economies, and we basically regulated the world of stuff and kept the world of bits unregulated. And perhaps it was sort of misguided environmentalism. Perhaps it was a variety of other things that went into it. But anything involving the physical world, real objects, was basically heavily regulated. The virtual world, the world of bits, stayed fairly unregulated. And so you had this progress in computer engineering and financial engineering, which probably is now about to get regulated, and basically a slowdown everywhere else. When I was an undergraduate in the 1980s, sort of one of the standard things people say is we need more engineers in society. But looking back 25 years later, engineering was a terrible field for people to go into a quarter century ago. If you went into engineering, computer engineering worked, financial engineering sort of worked, every other engineering field was bad. And this was true whether it was civil engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, biomedical engineering, to say nothing of nuclear engineering, petroleum engineering, aeroastronaut engineering, all these other areas. And so when people say, well, why did all the rocket scientists go to work on Wall Street? I think, and the analysis is, well, they got paid so much on Wall Street. That can only be half the story. The other half is they didn't get paid very much as rocket scientists, and if you couldn't build faster airplanes anymore because they were deemed to be too loud or too fuel inefficient, you naturally had a world where the rocket engineering got outlawed. Now, I think this is, if you agree with me in my view that the only way we have progress in the advanced countries is through technological innovation, this is sort of a major driver of progress, then this is sort of the catastrophic thing for the government to regulate, because once it stops that, everything else stops. And in this way, I think the political policies in the last 30, 40 years were dramatically worse than in the 1930s in the US, where even though a lot went wrong in the New Deal, they were at least smart enough not to stop technological innovation. And so if you looked at the 30s as a decade, you had basically the creation of the movie industry, the creation of the aerospace industry, household appliances were developed, you had the secondary oil recovery industry gained a lot of traction, the plastics industry was built up, and even though the government sort of took more and more of the gold and the money from the people, it didn't kill the geese that were laying the golden eggs. And in the last 30, 40 years, we've sort of eradicated all of them with, I think the one signal exception being the computer industry that's left today. Sort of a thought experiment I would suggest if you want to sort of contrast computers with biotech is if you had a video game, say take Zynga's Farmville, this is a random example, and you said, what we have to have all video games subject to FDA scrutiny, and we have to determine whether they are effective and whether they're safe and effective. So first off, does it do anything bad to your brain? And then secondly, does it actually improve your brain functioning? And we have to do a 10-year study to do that with a control group. And then after, if you change one line of code, you have to start the whole 10-year study all over again. Now, I would submit that if you were to apply the standards you have in biotech to video games, you would not have a video game industry either. And I think that's roughly that's roughly what's happened. And we really underestimate how much damage the government's done in technology because most of these technologies do not exist. And we sort of have a failure to imagine how much better things could have been had we not taken this catastrophic detour 30 to 40 years ago. My own view is that not only have we taken this very bad detour, but we are for the most part not aware that this is the detour we've taken. And so the idea that all the geese laying the golden eggs were killed off by the government, or almost all of them were killed off, is not yet something people are aware of. And so the assumption was that, of course, things were still progressing as before, that you could have progress without innovation, without people doing new things. And the way this fake progress, I think, has manifested itself in recent decades is through a series of extraordinarily big and destructive bubbles that have contained a fake story of progress that substituted for this real story. You had a version of the tech bubble in the 90s where there was a small part that was real, a lot of it unfortunately was not, because people believed we still lived in a technologically accelerating civilization. It was easy for people to believe that. It probably, it created lots of damage, but Clinton did get reelected in '96, probably as a result of the tech bubble. 2000s, we had an even bigger, even crazier bubble, and we sort of doubled down on housing and finance. And it was an even crazier story because at least the tech bubble was focused on the thing that was going to drive progress. In the last decade, it was people got very, very excited about owning, owning dirt, owning land. So that was the main component of house valuation, and basically, and again, there was an implicit story of incredible progress in the background. That story didn't quite work because there was no longer enough technological innovation happening. It was good enough to get Bush reelected in 2004, although probably the cost to us as a country was incredibly high. Now, I would have bet in 08, 09 that after two insane bubbles, you couldn't do this twice. Sort of like fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I'm not sure what you do when you have a third one. And it probably would be very hard to get a full-fledged third bubble going because people are a little bit more skeptical. And that's why I think to the extent there's a third one that's getting started, it is basically a bubble in government itself, and it is manifested through incredible deficit spending. Like the previous bubbles, it involves a story about the future that's not plausible because the underlying drivers of technological progress have been undercut by the government we have, and I think this bubble is is probably bigger and dumber, if possible, than even the housing and finance bubble of the last decade. In some sense, it doesn't matter that much whether or not it's good enough to get Obama reelected. That's probably the one person who will benefit from this bubble. But at any rate, we will all have to deal with it in the years ahead. And I think against this sort of backdrop of this sort of bubble economy, we're now getting to a point where there's some kind of reassessment possible. I think we're not quite there yet as a society. We may have to still go through one last really crazy bubble, but when this one is over, it will be time to sort of reassess the entire history of the last 200 years. And I think the only thing left standing will be something like a libertarian account of what's going to happen. When the government bubble breaks, the people in this room will be the people who will be the only people who have been right all along, and it'll be all people. Now, I think we can sort of. There's many other threads one can explore in this line of questioning. I think there are many different questions. I think one should try to tackle on different levels. So I think the policy analysis is we have to get tech deregulated and restarted if we're going to create a better future for the next few decades. And we're not quite there, but I'm hopeful there'll be some serious reassessment of this in the next few years. We need to, I think that, and that there's room, and then I think individually, all of you need to think really hard about how do you escape the bubble dynamic in your own life. And the residual part of it is of course the education bubble, which is a very important subcomponent of the government bubble. I've spoken on this at great length in the last few years, but it is basically similar to the housing or finance or tech bubble, where it involves a story about something that's probably overrated, that you're paying an enormous amount of money for. I don't judge anyone who's going to college or getting a college degree. I think there are lots of reasons. That's the game people sort of have to play. But you have to keep in the back of your mind the idea that there's something deeply flawed with it, and that you can't count on it to give you as much of a boost as people say. I think one of the really pernicious aspects of all these bubbles is that sort of the money that was spent on them in some ways was spent to pay for people telling lies about how there was no bubble. And so if you think about the housing bubble and the government agencies that helped provide all the credit, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all those agencies, in effect it paid for real estate brokers and people on Wall Street and all these other people to tell trillions of dollars worth of lies about why there was no housing bubble. And the sort of the $1 trillion in student debt at this point, to first approximation, is going to pay for $1 trillion worth of lies about how great education is. And this is why when people at this point are starting to have some doubts and starting to think maybe there's something a little bit wrong with this extremely expensive education that's subsidized by the government that's still pushing people into this debt for decades to come, you have to know that we're already very, very far into it, because it's not like the debate's taking place on a level playing field. It's basically the people who question education on the one side, the people who are in favor of it, plus $1 trillion on the other side. And so once it's an open debate, the fact that it's so biased should give you some sense of where the reality of the matter lies. And so I think the questions we need to try to tackle are both the policy question of what can we do to get this country out of the recession, but then I think there's always the non-political question, and the one I would leave you with is the anti-political question, which is what are you doing to end the recession, and what can I do to end the recession? Because probably the biggest lie the government bubble is telling us is that it is the government that will end the recession, and that is the one thing that's wrong. And the sooner we get to asking the correct question, the better it will be. I wanted to make this as interactive as possible. So let me open it up to some questions and then just and go from there.